Yeah, okay. I'm going to facilitate this keynote, but it's not a conventional keynote. So Carolyn and Vanessa are going to have a conversation speaking all about parenthood and artistic practice and creative writing. So we're not going to do it as a traditional kind of formal keynote. And we would really love questions from you at the end as well. So if you've got any questions for Carolyn and Vanessa, please save them up for the end, and there'll be a roving mic with Paul there for your questions. But just want to introduce the day and just talk through the day. So hopefully you've picked up one of these little programs. If you haven't got one, they're on the registration desk at the front. You will have probably signed up to some of the events or maybe all of the events, but we're relatively quiet. So if there's an event you didn't sign up for and then you decided that you want to come along to, then you're very welcome to just come along to any of the events. So this session probably won't run all the way until 12, but thereabouts, maybe about 1:45. And then we've got lunch over in the Phoenix building. So the Phoenix building is off to your left as you come out of this building, and a group of us will probably troop over there. So just follow along. There's more exhibition over in the Phoenix building. So do come and have lunch and have a look at some of the amazing artwork that is over there from York St John staff, researchers and students, and come and have a look at that. And then we've got an interactive writing workshop with myself and Professor Tom Dobson from Education. Again, everyone's welcome, no experience necessary. It won't be scary, so please come along to that. Then an animated film for Isaac, which deals with the subject of stillbirth and baby loss, which is really beautiful, and there'll be a conversation around that as well. More coffee and tea, then a screening and discussion of Ernestine's film Breastfeeding Not on the Agenda, which had its debut last week and is really incredible. And then if you're staying all the way through the day, then a book launch for Blood and Cord Writers on Early Parenthood in the evening. All the way through the day, you will be fed and watered to keep your strength up. Because it's very important. Never knowingly undercated at York St John. So I'm going to pass over to Carolyn and Vanessa to introduce themselves and to talk about their practice and to have a conversation. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carolyn Jess-Cooke. I will introduce myself as I'll give you my professional background and try and give a picture of why I'm here today and what I'm hoping to bring to this conversation. So I am an academic. I teach creative writing. I'm a novelist, and my writing career, when I started thinking about having a family, I was very much thinking how to combine the two. And as I did try and combine the two, as I tried to combine more than the two, again and again, this question of how to write and have children was brought to my mind again and again. I've published 9 novels, and I also write poetry. And I ventured on a project in 2013 funded by the Arts Council on Writing Motherhood that really asked the question, why are we still asking women how they juggle writing? I was very much interested in how, when I would do events and people would hear that I had children, they would say, you know, how do you write and have children? But this was, and it was such a question that came up again and again. Any sort of interviews that I did, they'd ask this question. But my husband, who's not a writer, but that to me seems incidental, he would never be asked about how he does his work around his family. And it seemed to me to be a question that was layered. So over time, I could see that there was this kind of question within the question within the question. There was a question about how I did the work of writing with children, because we all know the second shift is real, that a lot of women actually do 2 jobs or 3 jobs or 4 jobs, that they have to sort of work extra. But there was also, I think, another element to the question that really intrigued me around the idea of women doing the writing, that shouldn't be a priority, that work is not seen as valuable if it's done by women. And of course, you know, the kind of work that comes with raising children as well, maybe I'm of that generation that before I had children, I was a feminist. I was the first person in my family to do GCSEs. No, I think a few did O levels, but was definitely the first to do A levels, first to go to university. And I thought, great, you know, the world is different, the landscape is different for me, but that's not the case with motherhood. So there's this kind of nexus, I think, when we talk about motherhood, that brings together all these different notions of feminism, of work, of value, that seemed of a different time, a different era. I think a lot of us have contended with this in our personal lives, in our professional lives. And so really, I want to bring that to the conversation, that I think there's so many different levels at which when we talk about motherhood, we're talking about so many different things. And when we talk about writing motherhood, when we talk about female writers with children, there's such a contention around the idea of creativity, around making literature, around writing, and what we should be even writing about, that I think is still being unpacked long after the project that I led in 2013. I feel like it was such a great project. There was, in the end, there was 85 female writers attached. But I think that it's great that there's a lot of literature now on motherhood, but we haven't moved forward as much as I thought we might have. And I really question why, especially as my oldest is 16 now, and it's not thinking of being a mother anytime soon, if at all, but still, that's irrelevant. It's about the kind of landscape that she enters, because although motherhood, I think, is the nexus for where we really see quite entrenched and archaic, if you like, attitudes, if they are still present in that space, they're present everywhere, and maybe diffused or more subtle, but they're maybe more brazen within that space. So I'm really keen to have fruitful, hopefully challenging conversations going forward about how we challenge this and how we make a difference. And I guess, begin to dismantle. And I think that if you do give a name to something, that it's maybe the first step forward in beginning to recognize it as taking up space, as affecting individuals. So sorry, that was quite lengthy, but
oh, thanks, Carolyn. Already there are so many things that I want to respond to in relationship to what you've said. So I'm going to try and hang on to them while I just kind of tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a strange hybrid creature in that I trained as a painter, but I now kind of write what you would loosely call art history. And one of the reasons for that is to do with the subject matter of the work that I was making when I was an undergraduate. Because when I was an undergraduate, I was making work about mother-daughter relationships. And in particular, I was making work, I was making quite large, ambitious, very fleshy paintings, which were thinking through the distance and the bond between myself and my mother. And one of the reasons I was doing that was because I was, as Carolyn was saying, I was the first person in my family to go to university. My mum's sisters all had their children around them in the village, because I was the youngest of all the cousins. So I had cousins who were in their 30s and there were already grandchildren around. So I was the black sheep that went away, and so there was that kind of weight, and that was in the context of this kind of quite intense pressure, kind of a matriarchal pressure, because of the way that my mum was trying to repair her relationship with her mother through our relationship. So all that was bound up in my painting practice as an undergraduate. And so got to my third year, and off I kind of toddled to the Slade for an interview. And I had a hellish interview for the Slade, where I was very firmly told by a certain male professor who's quite infamous that, you know, basically there was no space for the subject matter that I was engaging with. And when was I going to become an abstract artist? So that was this kind of definitive moment in who I was going to become. Because of course, when you're 21 and you're working class and you're going to some hallowed institution like the Slade, then, you know, you believe that their judgment is a judgment which tells you that you are not good enough. And so it was that kind of hitting a brick wall moment, which proved to be this enormous game changer in where I ended up. So that was when I was sat in the library in Sunderland University, where I did my painting degree, where I was very, very happy because I could be near the sea, where I was going through the kind of the postgrad manual, and I found this phenomenal new master's course, which was on feminism in the visual arts, and it was run by Griselda Pollock, and it was only, it had just run its first year. So I was like, oh, okay, that could be interesting. I'm kind of making all this work about mother-daughter relationships. This could be it. So from that moment, that's how I started to try to find the space to work through those things that, you know, if they were important to me, they're not just important to me, they're important to other people too. So through kind of going through Leeds, I started to read people like Rosie Parker and her book Torn in Two, thinking about maternal ambivalence, and I started to kind of, you know, constantly butt up against this idea of these universal noble human values that art is supposed to talk to, and all the things that are excluded from that. And so that is why my kind of career as an art historian, it's never really sat still for very long, because it's constantly pursuing all of the different things which don't fit that model. So over the course of my career, I've written about German Jewish refugee experience as being something which sits outside the construction of a white woman artist in America. And part of that project was absolutely about thinking about how the mother-daughter relationship was configured in that refugee experience. I've written about termination, I've written about maternity, I've written about miscarriage. And so I'm constantly kind of moving around the margins, I guess. And my kind of interest in kind of mother-daughter relationships and maternal experience kind of absolutely cohered when I had my son Seth in 2012. And I found myself in a quite extraordinary situation in that, on the one hand, through knowing Griselda and having had a very strong role model when I was at Sunderland, I had these great, powerful, creative working mothers as role models. And I was rereading Writing Motherhood the other day, and I was looking at that moment where you talk about Sylvia Plath working between 4 and 6. That was precisely the kind of the model that Griselda gave me. You know, when I was in my 20s, and I was so busy in my 20s because of course I didn't have children and I didn't have a job, I just had a PhD to write. And I would say, oh, I'm not getting anything done. She would say, well, just get up earlier. You know, that kind of, you know, very pragmatic model. So I had that model of, okay, so this is how I deal with this as somebody who is a writer, so is somebody who's a thinker, and somebody who's going to become a mother. But then the most extraordinary thing happened at York St. John, which I'm so grateful for, I can't tell you, in that I was working within a community of colleagues who all of us, about 5 of us, had children within the space of about 6 years. So we had this kind of rolling baton of maternity and maternity leave and coming back to work, where we all understood that extraordinary transformation that we'd all just been through, and how we were all desperately trying to hang on to that person that we had been before, but take account of this extraordinary, difficult, joyful experience that we'd had, and how that was impacting on our work. And all the work that's in the exhibition, the work of Christina Collieti, the work of Sally Taylor, all of those works are kind of testimony to that. And I think that's where I'll leave it before I run on any more.
Oh, there's so much to pick up on there. When you were talking about having children within a kind of community, and I was thinking a little bit about how things have changed in such a very short space of time, actually, because I had my first child in 2006, and I just remember that even maternity leave was so, it was like 4 weeks full pay, I think. And there was a real decision to be made. I mean, because then you went on to statutory pay, and I just remember that being it was a really hard moment. I think I went back to work when she was 16 weeks. But then I learned in America, there was no maternity leave at all. And my husband had a week off work, and then he could take another week unpaid. But I remember he went back to work when she was 2 weeks old. And I had moved from Northern Ireland to the Northeast to take up an academic post very recently, so I was just alone, and trying to navigate that whole. So I think a lot of the questions hit me very, very hard. I didn't have answers for a long time, but it's so interesting to me how we have shifted. There is a more balanced approach, at least, to maternity and paternity leave, or I guess parental leave now. You can take it, because one of my PhD students took leave, and she was able to share it with her partner. But that just seems to be extremely recent. We're in the 21st century, and but it's still only, it's not everywhere that's the case. In America, I don't think we are anywhere near that. And they say that, I think when I did the project, there was a huge proportion of women in America who would return to work. I mean, I know one of my friends, her sister returned to work when her baby was 2 weeks old, which I think is just phenomenal. But it's also really concerning that so many women do that. I mean, I had that choice when my first was born, because we thought, how are we going to pay the mortgage on statutory maternity pay? So you just constantly have these questions to make. But really, it comes back to the question of value and what is being valued. And that's what was kind of very clear to me whenever I was getting, I was allowed to take a full year, albeit most of it very not paid. I could take a year of maternity leave, but my husband could take 2 weeks. And so those kinds of shifts said to me quite a bit about what my job was meant to be, and how society valued me much more in the domestic space, which actually, as it turned out, and I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking this, but there's a lot of work, not just the writing, but there's so much work that's invisible and undervalued, and those kinds of binaries still frustratingly exist, and they feel completely out of sync with our time, but they're still there as a reality. I think that's the sort of difference that I had to confront with those questions of, how do you do it? How do you juggle what you juggle? And why those questions were being asked of me. And I think it still kind of jolts me a wee bit, even though my children are a wee bit older, it still jolts me, because it makes me think I have to defend why I do what I do, why I continue to work outside that sphere. Does that make sense? I'm not sure why that's the case. Maybe that's entrenched kind of social attitudes, but that question of value is very much underpinning, I think, anything that women do creatively, as well as having children, seems to come back to ideas of value and what is valuable in society.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think in some ways it's positively archaic, but in other ways it's completely indebted to that kind of neoliberal economy that we kind of live in at the moment. And the way that, I mean, I was just thinking about, I mean, in the news this week, we've been hearing about the kind of the crisis in the care sector and the deficit of what was it, 165,000 workers, something on those lines. And of course, the kind of the care sector is firstly caring for people who are not seen to be economically productive, in that they're caring for the elderly or they may be caring for the disabled. And so that's not valued. And care itself is something which, you know, I don't know if I'm reading this wrong, but I just think it's something which is seen as traditionally part of women's work, which is part of being unpaid, which is part of being invisible, you know. And I had a wonderful conversation with Kerry, who's my PhD student whose work is in Phoenix at the moment. Yesterday, was it only yesterday, or was it the day before? And we were talking about this kind of level of invisibility and the way that we kind of disappear within this kind of lack of value because of this kind of emphasis on economic productivity. Sorry, my menopausal brain's just totally lost its thread now. So there's, I think in some ways it's kind of incredibly timing. And to come back what you were saying about that kind of, you know, the nexus, I often feel that kind of contributes to the nexus of the not good enough, where because the care sector is in crisis, that is falling to, you know, historically it's fallen to women, and there's no real reason to suggest that it's not going to keep on falling to women. So people who, you know, if you think about, again, that kind of gig economy, the neoliberal economy, then women are putting off having children. So I definitely put off having children. And so you'll find yourself where you're waiting for some kind of career stability. But as you wait, then you have children, then you're less likely to have grandparents around for support. And you're more likely to start to become the kind of torn between care for children, care for elderly relatives. And then you end up, now I've remembered my thread, and then you end up in this kind of really peculiar situation where I feel guilty for wanting to do a good job, because I'm not kind of, you know, you feel wherever you kind of focus feels like is taking something away from what's elsewhere. And that, I think one of the things I was thinking about writing and making as a woman, and the way that, you know, it can be seen to be self-indulgent, it can be seen to be frivolous, it also kind of has this hangover of it almost seeming positively bourgeois, that there's a definite kind of sense of the luxury that class affords that enables you to do that. There's a kind of there's no presumption that people who are working class want to write and make things and have something which is really valuable to say. So one of the things that really interested me when I came back to work was, after having Seth, was that being a mother and feeling like, you know, having that huge piece of elastic which was just pulling me home over this 20 miles of train track, feeling like that, so feeling that I wasn't doing a good job enough there, compounded the feeling like I wasn't doing a good job enough as an academic, because I wasn't doing a good job enough as an academic anyway, because I was working class and chronically insecure. So, you know, there was this kind of wonderful little downward spiral for a good few months.
I think a few years, actually. I don't know about a few months. I think I'm still there. But just, yeah, I think whenever I started the project, there was this quote that I had heard that really made me bristle. And it was about how someone had, you know, it's obviously a clickbait kind of headline, but someone had written that for a female writer, a child costs them 4 books. And I remember really having to sit with this and think, what? Because on the one hand, I could obviously, again, for me, it was very textured, shall we say, because I thought, okay, how do you come up with 4 books? Because, every book is different, right? Some books will take a writer 10 years, some books will take a writer 3 months. It's just how it works. It depends what you're writing. We can't be that kind of black and white, heaven forfend. It's such a binary conversation, and that seemed to apply to that economics as well. But I've been recently thinking how just being a woman, sort of dealing with physical kind of changes in life as well, and illness, how much that might cost you in terms of your productivity. But I think it circles back to that idea of neoliberal, the economy and capitalism, and how value is really estimated. But I think in terms of costing us and kind of steering us away from writing, and even thinking about when I was still trying to juggle my writing with my children. I suppose juggle's maybe a useful shorthand, because a lot of the time it really did feel like the second shift. I'm not alone in that. I would have to get up either early or stay up late. I still stay up really late, because there's something about not being the default parent, that when everyone's asleep, I know no one's going to run in and ask me to make them a sandwich, and so I can actually give some brain space. I mean, just to give you an example, just in the default parent, like I was away for a while, and my 13-year-old phoned me, and she said, the radiator in my room is leaking. And I said, darling, your dad is literally downstairs. Go and tell him. I'm away. I'm like nowhere near the house. So can you go and tell your dad? But I thought this was just a sort of anecdote to show sort of the state of interruptibility, even when the children get older, even when they're not babies anymore, when they're relatively independent, I still get these phone calls. So the job of motherhood, even in my children's, so my youngest is now just about to turn 11, and my oldest, I've got 4. I had them in 5 years, mental. But so that job continues, but it shifts and it becomes just a different shape. But the kind of interruptibility continues, that I feel like I'm still, there's a part of my brain that is forever sort of dialed in, and I actually wonder now if it's always going to be that way, even when they're adults, because I'll still get a phone call when I'm on the other side of the world. My radiator is leaking. I know my dad's downstairs, but clearly you're the one to call here. But I see how the role of motherhood becomes so much more than I first anticipated. And again, the work of it is so expansive and continually expanding. But yeah, I wonder about the kind of economics of writing, and why that's such a threat, I think, socially. Because if it comes down, I think capitalism hates mothers, but writing is often seen as something that, well, it often is something that we do that's not paid, that is actually really important. I didn't become a writer because I thought, hey, I want to be a millionaire. I started writing because it was so important for me to find a creative space. I started writing when I was 7, actually. I grew up during the Troubles, and it was important for me to articulate somehow what was going on around me. And I still see that as so valuable for women. But it was really strange to me. Even a relative said to me one time that I'm very selfish for writing. And it really took me back, because I thought, wow, that's more in the nose than being asked, how do you juggle your writing with your children? That's proper, accusatory. So maybe it is coming back to that idea of indulgence. I wonder actually if it's also creativity as expressing yourself and having ideas that maybe aren't for women, that it comes back to that idea of, the pram in the hallway. I always thought that was about women having to attend to the crying baby, but it's not. It was actually always, it's going back to 1964, I think. But the whole kind of context of that phrase about attending to the child in the hallway, or the pram in the hallway, was actually the male figure in the home was the writer, being disturbed perhaps by the noise in the hallway before the mother attended to that baby. So it was never assumed that she was writing. It was always assumed that she was taking the child away to not enable the husband, the father, to get on with his work, his idea making, his creative venture. So yeah, there's a lot there, I think, in terms of much more than work, but actually about ideas and opinions and ways that impact the world ideologically that we're maybe not meant to contribute to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just reminded me then of A.S. Byatt's In the Shadow of the Sun, where the writer father is constructed as this person behind the door which you do not open, which you do not disturb, this kind of hallowed space, and that absolute I know, that absolutely goes back to kind of classical Greece, and this idea of the celibacy of research and the celibacy of thought and the privilege of that space. And so that kind of models, I think, is alive and well in the kind of ideologies and the rhetoric around the studio and studio practice. Because there's a beautiful book which I absolutely love by James Elkins, which is called What Painting Is, and it's just fantastic. It's fantastic in its insight, it's fantastic in its bonkersness, and he talks about the way that the studio is an organic space where the kind of the mess and the stink and the contagion of the studio, you know, it holds the artist and follows them wherever they go, where it's, you know, the paint turns up on the books and it turns up on the clothes, and it kind of envelops the practitioner. And what's at the very heart of his argument is this idea that the authenticity of your ability to work with and through the medium is absolutely indebted to the time that you can immerse yourself in that space. And I'm completely schizophrenic about how I feel about that argument, because on the one hand, I completely agree with him. And there is nothing better, as far as I'm concerned, than 7 a.m. immersed in lots of really smelly, horrible unguents and pigments, and it's great. But the moment that you start to bring a child into your life, even before they're born, you are expelled from that space because of the toxicity of the medium, because of the tiredness, because, you know, I mean, I remember when I was expecting, every little smell knocked me sick. There was no way I could go near anything like that. So it's almost like you're immediately put in exile from your kind of creative identity. And I think one of the things that's really difficult for artists is how they negotiate their exclusion from that space. So that was kind of one of the things that was kind of occurring to me. And I guess that the challenge then becomes, okay, so how do I not do the same thing that generations before have had to do, and how do I absolutely radically exclude my children from my professional life? How do you do that? On the one hand, there are certain pragmatic things you need to do, like you do need to try and ring fence some time, with the caveat that you will always be interrupted. I run a CPD session for York St John, which is about life, work and sustainable research, and the first slide has an image of Seth banging on my doors to be let in, because, you know, I know that's going to happen. But I think one of the things that I found so fascinating is trying to think about, okay, so all this new experience that I am having, all the challenges that I'm facing, how is that going to have some kind of impact on how I think and how I work? And, you know, I don't think there is any way that I would have got half so fascinated and incensed by questions around creativity in education had I not been watching Seth go through that system. And so it puts you in a whole new social context, educational context, and so that's kind of a radical transformation, particularly I think for somebody who's kind of based in art history, where art history quite likes to be in its nice pristine little gallery space, and kind of think about the work and struggle against those terms that I was talking about at the very beginning, that kind of universality and that noble kind of elevated idea of culture. How do you start to break that? Which is why I find practices like Kerry's so fascinating, because what's at the heart of Kerry's work is this desire to firstly mess around with all of those protocols of practice, and instead of creating some kind of central artist's self who is dealing with the nobility of the human condition, is making a body of work which is actually about how mother carers are effaced as a self by the system, how their children are become anonymized, dehumanized through the system, and how, you know, to plagiarize was the work, you know, shout into this void, where basically what they're dealing with is this sea of bureaucracy, where, you know, by, you know, tiny 1,000 cuts removes their sense of who they are and their value, to come back to that.
I think you make me think a lot about identity. I wonder if that's something that we should touch upon as well. Because I think one of the reasons why as well that I think that motherhood is the real sort of the meeting point for so many different contentions, and it was where I really saw where my identity had shifted, that, you know, even in terms of my name wouldn't be used, and I bet I'm not alone, and you're so-and-so's mom. There's, you know, other mothers, I still don't really know their name because I just see them as so-and-so's mom, which I think is, but maybe that's the same with the fathers, but I don't know. There's something also about how you interact with, as you say, bureaucracy, that, you know, I would continually, my husband a few times when we had to deal with things like Senkos at school and so on. We've got a couple of children who are autistic, and having to deal with the council and so on, they would often say, no, we need to talk to mum. No reason, just there's some kind of binary that I was the assigned primary caregiver. So this sort of identity as, you know, as so-and-so's mum, and not really seen as an artist, that drove me more to, even when things were logistically very, very difficult, it made me cling to my writing and to my practice. It became more urgent for me to have a space, just as I had really clung to that space when I was a child, and I developed a writing practice, I guess, and wrote little books and so on. And that was really where I was articulating, even though it was fiction, even though they, you know, had different sort of supernatural elements, I was still really writing about what it was like to experience the Troubles and a violent household. And that was so important. And as I grew older, I think all the kind of identities that are imposed upon you, whether you're a mother, even in terms of class, I think that, you know, I found I can shake that off in my creative space, all the sort of expectations and judgments and confinements that come with the different ways that we operate in society under those particular identities that maybe you inherit. I felt like I could shake that off in my writing, or write through them, and give them a different voice and a use and a purpose, and create something that might create a conversation with someone else. Because of course I think creativity is about that connection that you're trying to make with even an imagined reader or an imagined audience. So sorry, I think I've lost my thread now. It's so early in the morning, but I think identity is really, really important. And so when we, you know, experience these confinements with our writing or with our making, and we have this kind of idea that this is not work that we should be engaged in, I think it's somehow impacting ourselves as human beings, as how we see ourselves as our identities. And that's a much more difficult thing to measure, to talk about, but I think it's really real. And so really it's yeah, in my view, I think we should all be engaged in writing to some extent. We talk about journaling now, that's quite in vogue, or expressive writing, but certainly for me, it was just any kind of writing was just useful for me to create a tangible thing, not so much an object, but just to see my writing down on the page, not the mess of thought, but something that is a voice speaking back almost. Yeah.
No, I completely agree with that, because I think, I mean, when I first joined St John University, it was very much more a kind of a teaching intensive institution, and so my kind of research outputs took a bit of a dip, and it wasn't until I went on maternity leave that I actually got my writing back. And part of the reason for that is that, for exactly the reasons that you're saying, I needed my writing to kind of affirm, okay, this is me now. And so Seth used to go down for the 2-hour nap, and that was it. I didn't care that the washing didn't get done or the hoovering wasn't done. Yeah, that was my little window of opportunity. Coffee on, sat down, hammer away at the keyboard for 2 hours. And those little windows were absolutely about, okay, I'm doing all these roles now, and this is where the headspace is. This is where things get organized. So even I write nonfiction. So even though I'm writing nonfiction, I'm still kind of writing through the experiences that I'm dealing with. I mean, I constantly deal with questions around displacement and loss, and all of those things. And when I was writing I wrote a piece in 2017 which went into the Sculpture Journal, and it was about this kind of earthwork, and it's got all this narrative about death and destruction around it, and which I was unpicking, and I was using the writing of that to think about attachment and loss and death, because my father-in-law at the time had terminal cancer, and my son and my father-in-law had a wonderful relationship, and I knew that Seth was losing his granddad, and that completely came through the writing of that, and that was my way of trying to contain things and deal with things. So I think, you know, that idea of writing and making of this affirmation of a self, which isn't this cold, hard professional self which sits out in this kind of, you know, discrete space, but it's this self who is absolutely informed by that lived experience, I think is really important. Yeah.
No, sorry. I've been thinking about some of the themes that keep coming up in my fiction. So even though I don't write nonfiction, I'm really interested in form, actually, because I think from a young age, I actually preferred using fiction as writing, because I could control the narrative, if you like, and there was ways that I could see, maybe even subconsciously, some of the things that were happening around me and that I was responding to in the work that I was doing. I was telling stories, but it was all filtering through, and that was, to me, the most valuable tool, rather than writing about it directly, I think, because I didn't have a name for what was going on, but I still feel that way. You know, I'm in my 40s, and I still feel sometimes that it's through the writing that I'm able to express things that maybe are beyond language, and that's what's so important. But the theme of, you know, women and women's work and identities has continued to come through much more than just the direct kind of expression of motherhood or new motherhood, But recently I've been embarking on projects looking at witches and that terminology, because it is such a dehumanizing term that we continue to use, you know, long after its coinage, you know, in the early modern, I'm not actually sure off the top of my head how long that word has existed. I was in the British Library yesterday actually looking at the Malleus Maleficarum, which is witch's hammer, written in 1487, basically a witch hunting manual. And there was another book from 1590, and it had this line, where there are women, there are witches. And I just thought it's so interesting how, you know, this dehumanizing practice from so long ago continues, I think, because we still use the word witch in terms of a woman, even though it was never, you know, at the beginning it was never a term just for women, but it became that way. I'll just start again before my brain stops me from speaking entirely. The gendered aspect of the word witch increased, particularly with James VI, you know, belief that women are more susceptible to the wiles of the devil, etc. But I think these kind of dehumanizing terms, such as witch, in respect to women and how they influence society, are really quite, it's interesting to me how it continues, but it all seeps through into motherhood as well, into what the word mother means, and how that is, I'm not saying it's a dehumanizing term, but it's definitely a term that comes with certain expectations that you are taking on an identity, and if you step outside that, then you are selfish, or you're indulgent, or you're, you know, it's such a taboo still to be an ambivalent mother, or to maybe even articulate some of the, and that's another thing, isn't it? But, you know, to talk about the real hard parts of being a mother. When I had my children, I was really gobsmacked how much I didn't know, that no one had talked about. Because I thought, but I have a relationship with my mother and my grandmothers. Why did no one tell me that breastfeeding is hard? How did I not know this? Like, it's not a new thing. It's literally since the dawn of time. So why are these things not being talked about? It's the same with menopause, though. It's only in the last 10 years that I've actually realized that menopause might be a hard thing, that I just had, why have we not talked about? So it's female bodies, female experience, I think, that female creativity really has a direct link to. It's how we express ourselves. It's how we write about our experiences. And if we don't write about them, if we don't make into that space, then we don't express. And it's not one experience, obviously. It's so vast. As motherhood is not just one experience, is it? It's so multivarious. So
as you were talking, I was just thinking about that question of the body. One in the piece that I wrote about the practice of Virginia Bodman, she made a body of drawings because she was excluded from the studio while she was expecting. She made this body of drawings, and one of the things that I pursued there is that thinking about the form of the thing. And one of the things that I argued was she made these beautiful ink sepia on Japanese paper drawings, which didn't have any heads. And one of the kind of the lines of inquiry that I kind of followed through was that idea of the way that through that process of maternity, I only was perceived as a body. and that body wasn't the body that I knew anymore. And precisely that because I mean, I think like lots of people of my generation who were, you know, in their 20s, in the 90s, you know, the pill was everywhere, and my body did what I told it. You know, it was regulated, and it you know, I could have quite happily been a Cartesian subject because my body was just like not an issue. And then all of a sudden it starts to do things which like it kind of misbehaves, and your blood pressure goes labile, and you end up blue lighted into hospital when you're supposed to be having a home birth, and all those kind of things. And I was just it wasn't that my kind of experience of childbirth or whatever was particularly overly medicalized or anything. It was just that sense of my body became overwhelmingly present, either because of my physical experience of it, and just as we used to joke, my husband and I made a joke when I was in about my 8th month of pregnancy that we needed something to get me off the sofa. So we invented the mythical crank system called the winch, which would get me off the sofa. To that kind of much more kind of having a child literally 2 days before your 40th birthday and not being able to walk for about 5 weeks afterwards. So that overwhelming encounter with the body, its ability to kind of somehow perform what was expected of it. You know, think about questions around breastfeeding and all the expectations that come with that, and all the guilt that comes with when that doesn't work. So I think it's kind of interesting to think, okay, so how do we navigate that way that we are seen as bodily, and how do we articulate the experience of that without kind of then falling into some kind of pigeonholed idea of what we are? And so it is this constant kind of oscillation between being the thinking subject and the bodily subject, and how those things come together, which still fascinates me, how we kind of keep that going, I think.
You're right, yeah. You make me think about when I did the Writing Motherhood project in 2013, 2014, Holly McNish had come out with a poem about breastfeeding in public, and it went viral. It was a spoken word poem that she had delivered via YouTube. It got 1 million hits in a week, etc. Yeah, and it just made me think again, because we still see that it's so taboo, that the female body is so sexualized, and even in terms of breastfeeding, it's so interesting how that was one of the things that I really grappled with when I was pregnant and a new mother, how my body was not mine, and it was, people would touch me suddenly, strangers would touch my stomach. I really struggled with that. I thought, you know, why are you touching me? Really, if someone came up to me now and touched my stomach, I'd be affronted, as I was then. But it's about that sort of the public nature of your body and your identity sort of coming down to your body. And I think, you know, we could definitely have a whole day on how female bodies are policed and so on. Sorry, I had like 5 different thoughts at once, and I was trying to pick which one to go with. Yeah, but I think this comes down to, you know, the idea of the female as vessel, as birth giver, and it's very, very difficult, I think, to escape that as a maker, as a creative maker, because we have to constantly grapple with the idea of the body politic and all the sort of ideas that come around that female body and how we sort of become public, whether or not it's through motherhood or otherwise. I think there's that dynamic that we have to contend with. I wondered if, I'm not sure how much time we've got left to discuss, or if we wanted to open it to the audience. But yeah, I think these sort of conversations to me can sometimes feel circuitous, because it's very difficult to see a shift, but that shift does maybe happen quite gradually, because, as I said, even since my project launched in 2013, there have been slow shifts that I think are really pleasing, and we are having a much more nuanced conversation about queer motherhood, about motherhood as applicable beyond the biological context of that, and what that means and what that looks like. But I also think that in terms of creative practice and how we can nurture and sustain that and make sure that there's a space for that in society, in a society that renders women's work as invaluable, you know, I'm very invested in thinking about ways that we can, I know there's a workshop this afternoon, but I'm very invested in ways that we can look at supporting mothers with that writing and that idea that they can have a sort of creative practice that creates a new identity that enables them to have a non-bodily practice, or a practice that maybe exists outside that space. I'm wondering if there's any topics that we haven't touched upon that we should look at before we open up to the audience.
I think maybe we should open up to the audience.
I'm happy with that.
Okay.
See where that takes us.
It's nearly 20 past.
Yeah, I think it would be good. Yeah, I think it would be good to open up to the audience. So if you have a question, Paul has got a mic there that we can bring over to you. Yeah, we would love to.
Hello. So I have a vested interest in my question, like so many questioners, which I may as well fess up to. I'm writing a book at the moment called Gender Care and Outsourcing in Contemporary Literature. And I'm really interested in the way we view outsourcing as mothers, and as people who outsource various bits of care work and domestic work. And as people who might want to do that, even if they can't do that. Anyway, so this is my question. The criticisms that have been voiced about capitalism, the anti-family or abolitionist family work that's going on the sort of far left at the moment, like Sophie Lewis's recent book, I'd be really interested to hear what you make of that movement that's going on, because it feels to me as a mother and as an academic that there's a lot of tensions in the way that that theoretical work is coming out, demanding for the sort of resurgence of the Firestone abolition of the family, but in a more contemporary guise. And I'm interested in, if we get rid of the family, what do we replace it with, and how do we do child rearing in other ways, and are they even realistic or practical, or what mothers would want? It's a lot of questions, sorry, but that's anything around any of that would be great.
I haven't read Sophie Lewis's book, so
No,
I feel
sorry.
hesitant. But I've made a little mental note, because I'm like, that sounds like something I want to look into, because yeah, I mean, I wonder, would I be able to ask specifically what you had in mind in terms of your thoughts about outsourcing care? Do you mean are there specific areas, or
So yeah, I suppose the two things are slightly different, my question and the book I'm writing. So the book I'm writing is structured around 5 figures to whom we outsource care: the surrogate, the nanny, the cleaner, the nurse, and the care home worker. But as part of the introduction to that, I'm grappling with what it means to outsource care, or what it means to insource care, the wages for housework, types of debates and or not debates, protests, and the history of feminist engagement with unvalued feminist work, the second shift, all the rest of that. So that's the context. Whether anyone's read any Sophie Lewis doesn't really matter. I'm really interested in what in how do we value mothers, but also shift the family, or reconfigure the family, or think the family differently in such a way that we escape some of the structures that make it so difficult to be a mother. Is that, I suppose that's a better phrasing of the question.
I don't know if I'm sorry if this doesn't if this doesn't answer the question, or kind of take it in the way that you were thinking, but there was a poem in the Writing Motherhood collection by Tess Gallagher about ironing a shirt, and it's so simple and so beautiful. Basically a scene of a woman ironing her husband's shirt and her daughter watching, and that just gave me so many kind of chills in terms of what I was kind of signaling to my children, not just my daughters, but my son as well, in terms of work. And yes, I think I absolutely hear what you're saying about, you know, because recently there's been some high profile kind of criticisms around surrogacy, and that's made me think, yeah, it's made me uncomfortable in how, you know, we're kind of viewing the female body and that kind of work. But I don't know that I have thought through that enough to kind of come back with my definitive thought on that. But yeah, I'm not sure if you want to feed in.
Oh no, I'm doing the mute thing, so it doesn't. Yeah. Oh, I have lots of thoughts, none of which I'm sure are very helpful. One thing that kind of sprang to mind was something that's come through my supervisions with Kerry, and tell me to shut up, Kerry, if this is not appropriate. But I was thinking about the way that people who have lifelong caring responsibilities, say for example caring for a disabled child, if in their kind of search for additional care, that their requirements for their needs to be met as a human, that can be seen as not caring enough, not loving enough. And I think that is profoundly damaging. And that does come from a very traditional idea of what the family is and what a woman's role is in particular as a caregiver. So for me, I can, not having read Lewis's book, I can see how ideologically it's problematic, but also kind of having grown up through the tail end of the second and gone through the third wave of feminism, I'm also equally mindful of the very different positions between the right to be childless, which should be absolutely fine and a given, but equally the desire and the love and the reward of having a child. And I don't think that mothers should be punished for desiring that kind of connection, which you only really get with your own parents and your children. So I suppose that, and I guess as somebody who is kind of currently in a situation where I have a 10-year-old son, I also have a soon-to-be 79-year-old father who has Alzheimer's, and another kind of litany of health conditions, and my capacity to care for my father is impeded by the fact I am not a professional, and I do not know 97% of the time how to help him. And to a certain extent, my role as a daughter, that's not my job. And so there's lots of, I think there's so many questions and not like kind of one nice, neat, tidy answer that I've got, because, you know, just thinking about the way that you were talking about the different kinds of outsourcing. So if my friend comes to clean my house once a month, then that's the weekend that I go and visit my dad, because I know that I don't have loads of housework to do when I get home. So the outsourcing the care on the one front enables the care on the other front. So it's this incredibly complicated, I have to say, no-win situation, to be honest. Sorry, I don't know if that remotely answered your question. Yeah,
I mean, I remember personally, I grappled for years with getting a cleaner in, and I think that was maybe I don't know if that's maybe a working class thing, but I really, 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 really dealt with a lot of shame around having, you know, getting a cleaner in, and still there's a mental block. But I have two cleaners now who are both men, which is unusual. and they're amazing, and I'm very happy for that to continue because they do a job that I cannot. But it really is about facilitating care because there's so much, there's so much that goes on in the home. But I really just want to say thank you for raising that and for mentioning Lewis's book, because I want to go on and have a look.
Thank you, and thank you for such a generous conversation. It's really fascinating to listen to it. I was wondering about interruptibility and whether you think that's had an impact on the form that your work takes. So I too have felt the pressure of that headline that you mentioned, 4 books is equivalent to a child, like what a horrible thing that does to our thinking, both about what a child means and also what it means to make work, like that direct equivalence. You've got to substitute one for the other. But sort of maybe thinking against that sort of equivalence, or like one minus the other, I wondered if you think, the kind of work you're making is affected by interruptibility, whether that produces new forms of work for you, or is it always to the detriment of the work?
I wouldn't pair new forms and detriment by any stretch. I think there is no denying that the big shiny lovely monograph that I wanted to write, which in my head, my last one came out in 2010, so I was figuring, okay, the next one will be about 2015. Yeah, that still hasn't happened. But the thing about my discipline is that you can quite happily publish 6,000 to 8,000 word journal articles, and that works really nicely. But I would agree that I've not, until actually last week when I finished the synopsis for the new book project, that there hasn't been the kind of headspace to conceive of that big project. But I would say that the form that project is taking is absolutely indebted to the experiences that I've had over the past 10 years. And actually, I think it's also that experience has actually kind of made me braver in lots of ways, braver academically, where, and I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm not afraid to call things now that I think need to be addressed. Whereas I think previously I would have tiptoed around the niceties of the discipline, whereas now I'm much more kind of, no, I'm just going to come out and saying this. And I don't know if that's just because, you've been through childbirth and what's worse that could possibly happen, but it's, I think there's, it's kind of like not a kind of a straightforward thing. The length of the project might have suffered a little bit, but it was almost like I kind of needed to do those shorter form things to gather my thoughts and to kind of to stake out my territory. And then I knew that once I was firmly planted, then I could do the bigger thing, if that makes sense.
So I remember Raymond Carver, the short story writer, saying that he the only reason he sort of, I don't know if he said the only reason, but he said one of the main reasons that he wrote short stories was because as a parent, he could kind of do that in an evening after his kids went to bed. And I really resonated with that because I started as a poet. I started publishing as a poet. And I just found that I could write these shorter pieces because I could, give that was the sort of X amount of headspace that I had for that particular work. But now I published a poetry collection last year, but I'm more a novelist. That's what I write, 90, 100,000 word novels, usually one a year, although it'll be 2 this year, which really is antithetical to the whole interruptibility. And I have had to change as a practitioner. I've had to change my approach. I say have to because I have a publishing contract that suddenly you have a real serious choice to make. Do I take this publishing contract from a really great publisher, this shiny thing, or do I say, no, I'm sorry, I just can't, because my daughter might phone me to tell me her radiator has bled. So I have said, no, I'm going to do this, but it has required a huge shift. And, you know, in some ways it's been a good thing, because it has shown me that I can actually do this. I can sort of, you know, find a way, if you like, to continue this thing that's so valuable to me, to my work that's so valuable to me. I can do this because a novel really is such a marathon, that it just feels like you need this massive headspace for it. And so now what I do is I go away to write. I have to go away sometimes to an Airbnb. I say to my husband, are you are free? Or my mother-in-law is free to come up. Again, outsourcing. But, you know, and I'll still get phone calls. I'll still get WhatsApp messages. I once got a grant. So this was 2018. Yeah, I got a grant from the Arts Council to go to Norway for a couple of weeks to research the book that I was writing. And I was so scared to do this. 2 weeks, just, it might have well have been a century. You know, 2 weeks leaving my, how old was Willow? I think Willow was 6. And she was diagnosed with autism at 4, and the idea of leaving her at all was just like, oh my God. But suddenly she was able to speak and articulate, become able to speak more. And I was really worried that she could not express. When I was with her, I could sort of pick up on what was wrong. But for me to go away and not know if she needed something was just really frightening. But now she was able to like speak to me on the phone, etc. But every single day I was away, I got phone calls from my kids saying, come home. So, you know, the guilt was present, but I'm sure it all fed through in very creative ways. So yes, what I'm saying is I have become very interested as a practitioner in the idea of constraint, because I am always working within constraint. There is never a moment that I feel like, oh, got swathes of time, swathes of brain space. Oh, it's great. Because frankly, even some days when I have a writing, like in the sort of alignment of the planets, when I have a writing day, sometimes I'm just exhausted and I really just want to lie face down in a darkened room and stay there until someone comes for me. So, you know, please don't be under any impressions that I'm just like this marathon runner capable. It's always, you know, hitting against my own mortality and my own sense of I cannot do this. But it does help when you've got a contract and you think, well, I can either do it or just, because you never know when you'll get one again. But it's been a useful exercise to see that actually I can do it. I can accomplish these things. And I'm glad I did, because pushing through all of that has made me, and I'm sorry if this is a bit twee, it has made me stronger, not just in terms of my practice, but as a person. And it's made me realize that that's a useful thing to even to teach my children, that, you know, mostly my children don't even know that I have a job, but occasionally they'll be like, I'll hear that they told one of their teachers that my mum writes books, and I'm like, oh, you were paying attention, God, that's amazing. So I think there's valuable ways that, and really important ways that we can achieve something by dealing with, whether it's interruptibility, whatever constraint you're dealing with in your life, whether it's through being a parent or a carer or anything. If you fashion ways to continue with what's important to you and work within those constraints, it's amazing how creative you can actually become with your, and I am inspired by other people. You know, I spoke to a writer who said when her children were wee, she used to get up at 2 a.m. and write till 4. Frankly, I immediately I was like, no, sorry, no, my brain wouldn't work at 2 a.m. But you do what you have to. That's what worked for her. So.
Sorry, I'm always just projecting in this room. So what time are we at now, Vanessa?
It's now 20 to 12.
So we've got a little bit of time before lunch, but we could just go and sort of have a mingle and have a chat in the foyer here, couldn't we? So at 12 o'clock we have lunch in the Phoenix Centre, where the rest of the exhibition for this day is based as well. So we'll lead you over there, because it's not necessarily the most obvious building to find, but that's not until 12, so we can hang out here for a bit, or you can have a little break. I think that was an amazing discussion. You didn't need me to prompt you, because you had so much to talk about. It was absolutely amazing. So can we give a little round of applause to Vanessa and Carolyn? Thank you so much, and I'm sure they'd be willing to take your questions outside if you're feeling a bit too shy to ask them any questions in this big space. So thank you very much.